Alrighty. Just briefly introduce yourself, if you don't mind, whatever you'd like to say or not say.
Sure. My name's Jesse. I am here talking to you because you wanted someone to explain why you were bad.
That's right. As bizarre as that sounds, that is correct.
Yes. So yeah, I've been following you on Twitter for a while. I've disagreed with some of your takes.
Okay.
Not all of them.
Let me just explain for people who may find that bizarre. And by the way, I'm just going to tweet this out, so
okay,
you're going to get a. Hopefully, your fellow haters, and I'm not really calling you a hater, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Your fellow haters will trickle in, and they can see if you make a compelling case against me. And by the way, I did offer $50 through Venmo to anybody who could make a cogent case as to why I'm bad, but as far as I could tell, you rejected that offer, which I respect. So hold on, let me just tweet this out.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So ever since I've really had a significant or moderately sized online profile, I've made a point to offer those who have a negative opinion of me, who disagree with me, who have all manner of objections to what I say or do. I've offered them an opportunity to have an open forum. So they can come, and if they are acting in reasonably good faith, they can present their criticisms of me, and I will respond in kind and good faith. Now, most of the time, these offers are not taken up because people would rather just lash out on Twitter or through vituperative emails or DMs or YouTube comments or whatever. But nonetheless, the offer is a standing one, and occasionally it's taken. People take me up on it. But you're, I think, the first who is not really a media personality who's done it. And I treat everybody, I think, roughly equally. So you don't have to be a media personality in order for me to give you an audience to express your views. And if you're somebody who's followed me for a while, which I appreciate, then I would assume that you have a relatively thorough understanding of what it is that you find objectionable and the things that you may agree with or disagree with, or whatever point you have to make. So why don't you just begin, and then I'll interject as needed, but I'll give you the space to complete your thoughts.
Okay. Well, actually, let me start by asking. You said earlier, I and the other haters will trickle in.
I was kidding.
I know, but I mean, a lot of your followers are people who like to disagree with you a lot.
Sure.
So from your understanding of the people who follow you, or the people who comment and follow you, what percentage of them would you say are haters in some fashion? In the sense that I'm a hater, not necessarily a negative term, but people who are there to disagree with you largely.
It's hard to say with precision because I think sort of the nature of online discourse is that people who have a negative opinion are going to be more likely to express that than people who have a positive opinion. Mm-hmm. Right? If I think that you are just dead wrong and I'm angry about what you said, I'm going to be more inclined to express that disagreement by way of making a tweet or a comment or whatever than somebody who says, "Oh, you know what? He's right. He's right on. Go Michael Tracey or whatever." Mm-hmm. So I think you're getting a skewed perspective if you gauge it just by who's like commenting or who's publicly interacting with you. Because I get a lot of people who actually do send me private messages who express a positive opinion, whether on a specific issue that I'm commenting on or journalistically covering, or just overall about my presence. So I don't know that I could accurately distill it into any kind of reasonable percentage because, you could look at the follower count, but then people who follow, there are people who follow Twitter but don't follow you for whatever reason, or don't even have an account. I've gotten emails from those types of people. I think most people who follow me on YouTube, which is a smaller percentage because it's not like a focus of mine, it's just sort of like a side amateur project. They, I think, are more positively disposed. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, but I like mixing it up, as you could probably tell. I'm sort of a preternatural debater. Been this way since I was really an adolescent. I like hashing out arguments rationally. And now, as an adult, I couple that with a journalistic approach and a public commentary style. So I wouldn't like it if everybody just agree with me all the time, right? I like to sort of probe the faultiness of conventional logic, or at least prevailing logic within certain circles. So, like within the online progressive media, there are definitely the sentiments within that sector of online discussion are not necessarily shared by the entire internet, but it's sort of an area that I have a lot of familiarity with. Like I work for the Young Turks, I've columnist for Vice, etc. So I have some personal familiarity with that world, although I also have familiarity with the conservative world, and I get in fights with them a lot as well. So I think there's a way that you can sort of probe logical inconsistencies within a range of ideological quadrants in a way that actually is useful and grounded in some principle, so that everybody can have a more honest understanding of each other.
Okay, so I think you sort of explained there one reason why you're bad, which is you are very conflict oriented, right? So you're, the charitable way to say it is you're probing for inconsistencies, you're trying to find the weaknesses in arguments and prevailing orthodoxies, et cetera. But I think the way you do it, and this is, it's the nature of Twitter, right? It's the nature of online conversation. The way you do it is very conflict oriented, right? It's aggressive, it's hostile towards these people with whom you disagree, rather than let's, like, these people have a fair point, these people are wrong for this reason, let's explore why the answer is over here. It comes across as hostile to various audiences, right? So sometimes it's like, well, now all the Russia people hate me, and now all the Bernie people hate me, and now all the whatever people hate me. If your experience of Twitter is which group is going to hate me now, then it might be because you're sort of poking your finger in their eyes, right? So,
but on the flip side, right? If I'm criticizing Trump, right, which I often do, part of the reason why I gained a moderately sized platform over the years is because people characterize me as like anti-Trump in a reflexive contrarian way. Like I was only criticizing the dominant modes of opposition to Trump because I got some kind of kick from it, or I didn't actually believe what I was saying, whether it had to do with the Russia investigation, impeachment, other aspects of the dominant ways in which Trump has been opposed that I don't find logically grounded or even politically fruitful. Okay, so, but let's say, on the occasions where I do stridently criticize Trump and I do journalistic interrogation of Trump's claims, Iran would be a big example. I mean, the MAGA people were super angry with me for taking a firm line against the Soleimani assassination, or even now on the early phases of the coronavirus response. I don't think you can call me anti-Trump. I've been pretty firm that Trump's public handling, in particular, his rhetoric around coronavirus, whether, he didn't literally call it a hoax, but it doesn't matter because you're not supposed to take a hyper literal approach to Trump in the first place, or so I thought. That was how his defenders sort of tried to contextualize Trump's comments. And I actually agree with that defense to some extent, because I thought there was a hyper literal knee-jerk way in which Trump was framed that wasn't helpful. And I explained this in a piece a week or two ago on the coronavirus response and Trump's handling of it. Okay. But put that aside, let's say I go after Trump hard. Am I poking in the eyes of Trump supporters? I guess you could put it that way. But then again, the Bernie people, or even the mainstream Democratic people, other factions of people who may follow me, don't perceive that as me poking in their eye. In fact, they like it. So it depends on who.
A small percentage of your audience in the eye at any given moment, right? But I mean, my objection here is sort of about the tone and the style and the things you choose to tweet about, right? It's I mean, look, not everyone has to be coming up with solutions, right? It's me saying, oh, you should be more solution oriented. That's kind of ridiculous, right? Like, you're a journalist, you do what you want to do. But generally, like, my objection to you as a follower who enjoys that that you're heterodox, right? Is that it feels like it's okay. This month, these are the people I'm going to be trolling. So like recently it became like Bernie supporters who think he should stay in the race or whatever. And I actually, this is one thing I respect, that you seem to be a big Bernie guy. And then when things changed and it became obvious that Bernie like had this opportunity to sew up the nomination if he had pivoted to the center, and he didn't. Once that became clear,
pivoting to the center is not quite how I put it, but yeah, I mean,
embracing the larger electorate, right? The larger Democratic electorate. Rather than
right, but then there was a way that could have been done without making useless concessions to mainline liberal sensibilities, which is what he did, and it didn't work. So he actually adopted a lot of the Russia hysteria. He would run around in every stunt speech saying that Donald Trump is the most dangerous president of all time, which Donald Trump poses many dangers, but when you contrast him with the previous Republican president who invaded Iraq, I think that's a little bit ridiculous.
Wait, are you saying that
you get the point? But
hold on.
Yeah.
Are you saying that that Bernie's embrace of the anti-Trump stuff, the Russian hysteria, as you described, you're saying that was sort of trying to capture the center of the Democratic Party or the right of the Democratic Party?
I think it was a conscious attempt, and I also think he believes it to some extent. It was an attempt that was conscious on his part and the part of his campaign to present him as within the mainstream of the party. And my point is, the people who prioritize the Trump hysteria, and I know that's a broad category, but the Russia investigation, in particular impeachment, the people who prioritize that would actually sort of modify or would allow their voting behavior to be guided by those things are not going to be natural Bernie supporters in the first place. So there are ways that you could have made him more mainstream that didn't entail making these useless concessions to establishment democratic orthodoxies, such as the Russia investigation. One proposal that I had, and I got berated for this as well, was like Bernie could have done things to project love of country and patriotism. I think he did. He does love the country in a way. That's why he's so passionate about changing it. But like, what would be the harm in making some symbolic gestures around that? He actually did that in 2016. Remember the America ad with the Simon and Garfunkel song?
Yeah,
that was great. That was one of his best ads, and it made him. It sort of suffused the Bernie campaign with the sense of Americana. And I don't think they did that this time, because it was all okay. Forget that. We're just going to be as blinkered in our anti-Trump posture as every other Democrat. And that eliminated his distinctions. And it's just like, so if you're sounding rhetorically just like Mayor Pete, just like everybody else, Biden, then I feel like that erases some of the distinctions that made you a novel force in 2016, gave your campaign energy, and it allowed those novelties to dissipate. But that was sort of a tangent, because we were making a point about like, okay, so I transitioned to anti-Bernie, not anti-Bernie, so to say, but like a Bernie critical posture in the past couple weeks. But it was never like I was a
Bernie stan.
stringent Bernie stan, right? Like I was one of the few people saying, look, it's important not to have an online echo chamber, not to have a situation where in the venues where people who are really engaged in the Bernie campaign and the sort of ancillary media spheres that have a lot of influence over the nature of the Bernie campaign, it's not a good situation where it's just apologetics nonstop. And so I was saying, look, I don't understand. First of all, I have substantive objections to the Russia stuff, but I also don't understand on a political level how that really behooves him. Right. So, and then after especially the primaries. I mean, I kind of said it was over after the
Super Tuesday.
Not Super Tuesday. I was saying, okay, look, almost certainly over after Super Tuesday, but let's wait until Michigan, right? So Michigan is the place where if he's going to have a significant, amazing comeback, that would be it. And he gets wiped out in Michigan, loses every county. He doesn't just lose Michigan on that date, loses Idaho, loses Washington State. He won Washington State by a landslide in 2016, even though it was a caucus transition to a primary, right? That actually kind of dispels some of the logic of the campaign, which is that if we increase voter turnout, we're going to do super well. Guess what? Primaries have a much higher turnout than caucuses. And every state that's transitioned from caucus to primary has seen his margins go down significantly compared to 2016. Got blown out in Mississippi, got blown out in Missouri on the day. So it's just like, okay, now it's functionally over, right? And then we get into the next round of primaries, which is Florida, Illinois, Arizona. The margins are even steeper. So I'm just like, okay, so what is now the rationale? Because the rationale for 2016 for him staying in the race the whole way through was pretty clear. Number one, California was one of the final states to vote. So if he has a miraculous comeback in California, then he has an argument going to the convention potentially. But now he's losing by blowout margins in states that he actually won or overperformed in 2016. Even Illinois, he only narrowly lost in 2016. This time he got blown out. Okay, so then what's the rationale? It almost feels, and even if you listen to him, he's like, oh yeah, well, we're assessing. Or we're going to, we're talking to our supporters. We're thinking about what to do. He's not saying, oh yeah, we're going, he's not like saying we're going to the convention or he's not talking about his candidacy with much enthusiasm. So at that point, I wonder if you're almost doing a disservice to your supporters by creating the impression that you're actively campaigning for the nomination when you're not. You're doing something else. You're using the campaign apparatus for a different purpose. And so that's sort of where I've now transitioned into like, okay, we're in sort of Bernie campaign autopsy mode. You've gotten a number of these pieces coming out in Huffington Post, New York Times, elsewhere. And, there's a faction of Bernie supporters who are still, thinking that this is a bona fide campaign. So they get offended if you say critical stuff, which you would expect to happen after a campaign fails, regardless. Like, I didn't get a lot of pushback from most people after the Hillary campaign failed in 2016. In fact, we spent like a year and a half doing an autopsy. So maybe they think that the autopsy now is preemptive. I don't think so. I think even Bernie realizes that. People in his campaign realize that. Just a matter of time. So to get back to your basic point, I almost don't think that it's just a matter of me wanting to troll Bernie. Like I woke up one day after Super Tuesday and said, okay, it's time to troll Bernie supporters. No, it's the conditions change. I see an analytical deficit in understanding the nature of why the Bernie campaign collapsed in fairly epic fashion. And therefore, I feel like it's incumbent on me, on somebody who is familiar with the campaign, knows people in and around it, has been following this stuff around for 5 years, was somebody who was pretty staunchly in favor of him in 2016, or like even if it wasn't even wasn't uncritical then either. But I tried to push back on some of the historical criticisms, and I saw the logic in why he would continue to the convention in 2016. Because he was building up a nationwide organizing network. He was still relatively unknown at the time, but now he's got universal name recognition. He's had 4 years to plan. So it's just a different set of circumstances. And that's sort of what my thinking was in sort of focusing on that aspect of things a little bit more post Super Tuesday. It wasn't just this reflexive, okay, time to, poke the eyes of Bernie supporters. There was a little bit more of a principled, reasoned approach, at least from my vantage point.
Okay. I mean, I agree with your assessment about Bernie. I was a Bernie supporter too. After Super Tuesday, I pretty quickly switched to like, this is over. The longer you stay, the harder you're making it for Democrats. There's no point in sticking around, right? So on the merits, I agree with that. My point is not that you reflexively look for the way to upset people. It's that you figure out which of your ideas will upset people and keep poking on that one. Which is, which makes sense as a media strategy, as a way to get engagement, as a way to differentiate yourself. I get that. But I want to talk about some of the substance of some things we disagree on.
Let's get into that, but let me make another point really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So if your arguments are tonal, right, or they're about presentation or emphasis, that's different from the substantive points, which I guess we're going to get to. But I think it is interesting that that a lot of the complaint, I mean, maybe even the majority of the complaints that I get are around tone, around emphasis, around seeming like a jerk. And it's just like, we're having a nice conversation now. I'm not being a jerk to you. I'm being accommodating to you. That's how I act in my personal life with people in private conversations.
Of course.
So it's like they conflate, if you have like an acidic public style that is based, at least in what you regard to be a principle, they make it seem that they conflate that. They're saying, I just agree with what you're saying, therefore you have to be a jerk on a personal level. And it's just not the case. I don't mind if people think I'm an asshole, because I'm generally not. I mean, you can talk to people in my private life. Maybe sometimes I can be a jerk. Everybody can, right? But for the most part, I try to treat people well. And it's just like, if your objections are tonal rather than substantive, then there's only so much you can do about your own personal tone, your own personal style and temperament. I mean, I try to take some of that under advisement, I guess, but I would much rather the objections be substantive, and then we can actually have a rational debate about them, rather than me like defending my tonal style, right? Because that's almost like, in a way, it's not even possible.
I see what you're saying, but I think it's wrong to say that tone and emphasis are not substantive. Like, we think about Trump's response to coronavirus, for example, his minimizing of it. Sometimes it's that he says it's a hoax, right? And I know it's a little more nuanced than that. He said the Democratic response to him is a hoax, which actually just shows that he doesn't know what a hoax means. Like, that's not a hoax. He's saying, oh, they're responding weirdly. But anyway, so some of it is the stuff that he says, right? But a lot of it is the emphasis and the tone. It's when he keeps saying, oh, it's like a flu, right? Like, it's when he goes out of his way to kind of minimize things, to say, oh yeah, things are looking great, and whatever. Like, a lot of the actual substantive bad things that are coming from Trump's response are about his tone and his emphasis. He's choosing not to emphasize, it's spreading in all these places and we don't have enough ventilators and this and that. Yeah, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay. I take the point with respect to Trump, but to state the obvious, he's the president. His tonal emphases are a little more warranting of scrutiny, I would think. But I must feel like it's hard to even know how to address objections of this sort, because it requires me like being put on the psychologist couch or something. Like, it seems a little fruitless. Like, we have to like delve into the deep recesses of my mind, right, to sort of divine why I may emphasize a certain thing or not. When maybe that's useful, I guess, in a way, but I would almost, in every circumstance, prefer that the objections be substantive, so then they can be replied to without it being like a characterological study of me.
Yeah. Well, let's think less about the tone then and more about the emphasis. Like, imagine there's a person who constantly, or let's call it a news channel, who keeps reporting on, every time some black teenagers beat up a white kid, right? Or reports on every crime committed by an illegal immigrant. The things they're saying are true, are factual, right? But the things they emphasize matter. And those are substantive decisions that they're making, right? And again, in your case, you're not Fox News, right? It's not like you're emphasizing things in order to make a racist point, but you are emphasizing things in order to make some kind of point. And when you make that, you're making that to the exclusion of all other points, whatever. But you're just a man, and so you don't have the same responsibility Fox News has.
If I was running a news organization, right?
Yes.
And I would think like one sort of recurring theme that you get in online criticism when you have a moderately sized profile. Okay, and I'm not trying to be, I'm not touting myself, but I have a moderately sized
it's
online
pretty big,
yeah. And one thing people will always say, and this was even the case back when the profile was considerably smaller, they would say, I'm so annoyed that you're focusing on this. I would rather you focus on this other thing. And it's just like, okay, so how could I possibly tailor when I'm inclined to focus on to what your preferences would be. You can feel free to focus on whatever you'd like, and you can not follow me or you can ignore me if you don't like what I'm focusing on. But I just don't know how I'm supposed to accommodate that, because clearly there are people who do appreciate the things I focus on, or else I would have no profile, right? So like, how do you navigate that dynamic in a way that appeals to everybody? One thing that I've learned is if you're constantly making people mad, doesn't mean that you're necessarily right, but it does give you a little insight into the futility of ever pleasing everybody. I mean, it's impossible. And if you're striving to always please everybody, then that probably means that you are pandering, or you're not thinking things through in a really robust way. So like one of the notion of both sidesism is, okay, if I angered Democrats 50% of the time and Republicans 50% of the time, that means I'm doing something right. That means I must be right. No, that's arbitrary. But if you are engendering attacks from people across the spectrum to some extent, it does hammer home to you, or at least has to me, that you can't even aim to please everybody, because it's impossible. And in terms of emphasis, yeah, I mean, I think that complaint would be a little more operative if I were running a news organization. But if I'm just running my own life, my own priorities, then I think that's a little less salient.
Yeah. I mean, we could debate about what your ethical responsibility is here, right? You got a microphone and 136,000 people or whatever are hearing what you're saying. I mean, if a news channel has 136,000 viewers, we think it has some responsibility for what it says, right? 136,000 is not a small number. But regardless, that's something for you to discuss on the psychologist couch another time.
Right.
But let's think about some of the substantive stuff.
Okay.
So a couple things came up for me in your Bernie thing. One, I really don't see the connection with, like, Bernie trying to pivot to the center. I know that's not the term you use, by having anti-Trump hysteria or the Russia hysteria. I don't think that's anything. I don't see evidence that that's what the right half of the party thinks and not what the left half of the party thinks. I don't see why Bernie would ever imagine this is the way for me to be mainstream, is to be, to think this Russia thing is a big deal. I don't see the connection there at all. And I think this goes back to your reading of Russia, which I struggle with. I also don't remember the details of Russia as well as I do the details of Ukraine. There's a time when I get a quote. Yes. But actually, I think maybe it's more interesting to talk about the Ukraine stuff, because you had one take that I thought was different and was important, but was also kind of missing the point, which was, should we be arming the Ukrainians in the first place, right? Like everyone's saying, and so the Democrats were making the argument, what Trump did here with the Ukrainians was wrong, and it cost the Ukrainians all these lives, and it was our foreign policy, it was essential to our foreign policy to be protecting them. And you were saying, well, no, it wasn't really. And maybe you're right about that. But I think that totally misses the issue of what the impeachment was about. Trump never made an argument that we shouldn't be arming the Ukrainians, right? He, in fact, signed the bill that gave the funding. And he bragged over and over about how Obama didn't even do this, but I'm arming the Ukrainians. So Trump was clearly on that side. He thought we should arm the Ukrainians. The problem was that he withheld that in order to get a concession from Ukraine, right? A pretty straightforward definition of bribery. So
then why didn't they charge him? Why didn't they charge him with bribery? Okay, so let me address some of those points.
Yeah.
I think it was worthwhile to talk about how the propriety of military aid to Ukraine, almost like any debates over that on the merits, got taken off the table in the context of this incredibly polarized, overheated impeachment issue. Because what happened in the course,
irrelevant to the impeachment. They were.
It wasn't. It wasn't. I mean, it wasn't irrelevant in this sense. Whether the policy is sound in the first place, I think should have bearing in how we view the subsequent actions taken in relation to that policy. Let me put it this way. If nobody is even considering, I mean, so military aid to Ukraine became like the top issue in American politics. I'm oversimplifying, but it became a major issue in American politics for months. Mm-hmm. And doesn't it tell you something that barely anybody, except for a couple sort of gadfly people on the internet like me, nobody ever even questioned the basic logic of sending military aid to Ukraine in the first place? The Trump defenders didn't do it. They, like you mentioned, bragged that they took more of an aggressive posture than Obama, because Obama refused to send military aid to Ukraine. So, like, rah, go Trump for sending aid to Ukraine, even though he initially expressed skepticism about the wisdom of doing that in the campaign, and then a little bit early on in the presidency, then he just gave that up because he was saying, okay, I have to be aggressive toward Russia. I have to prove that I'm not Putin's puppet. So he sent the military to Ukraine. And then you have Democrats saying, oh my God, I mean, it's our metaphysical responsibility to forevermore be sending military aid to Ukraine because we have to help them beat back Russia. To quote Adam Schiff, we have to fight Russia there, so we don't have to fight them here. That's not just some random backbencher. That's Adam Schiff, who is the lead impeachment manager on the floor of the Senate in a historic trial, using that kind of rhetoric. So I'm not willing to let every consideration around impeachment, which was multifaceted, and a lot of people who even were involved pretty intensely in the Russiagate stuff tuned it out because they're like, oh my God, this is so tedious, I can't even bother. I'm like, I said to myself, no, I have a responsibility, even though I agree that it's tedious, to follow the ins and outs. And I can't just, impeachment can't be reduced to a simple binary between impeach or don't impeach. You have to look at some of the sort of the orthodoxies that are being instilled in the polity as a result of impeachment. One of which was that aid to Ukraine became this sacrosanct issue. So, like, when I look at an issue like impeachment, I'm not thinking to myself, I'm looking through like a journalistic lens as well as sort of like a normative lens. Like, so let me describe what's happening, and let me also come up with my personal judgment as to the legitimacy of what's happening, right? So it's like a balance. And if I say to myself, okay, now we have the entire political class, the entire middle media class, roughly speaking, all united behind the eternal legitimacy of sending military aid to Ukraine, that seems like a logical flaw there that maybe would make sense for me to devote a little bit of energy to and to suss out the implications of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But I'm just thinking, I mean, your Twitter feed in front of me, right? But I'm thinking like your.
And by the way, I don't just tweet. I mean, I know people consume a lot of what I do through Twitter, but at least I try to write articles that make cases at longer length. I do these kinds of videos. So it's because obviously there are limitations in the medium of Twitter, right? So you know, I did a long piece in January on impeachment that got into some of this. And so, yeah, I mean, I grant that you can't convey the full scope of a number of any issue really through tweets. It's just one tool in your arsenal to make the points that you want to make.
Okay, so yes, I mean, I think, you know, what you're saying makes sense. The impeachment exposed this other unrelated issue about, you know, how we're more interventionists reflexively than we should. We're all accepting that intervention in this case was the right idea. When Schiff made that argument, it was a silly argument, right? It was irrelevant, because if Trump had done something, had signed something that Schiff thought was terrible, then Trump's withholding of that thing in order to solicit a bribe from someone else would be equally bad, right? It doesn't matter if Trump was withholding something that he should give or withholding something that he shouldn't give from Schiff's perspective, right? He was withholding something that legally he was obligated to give, and he was doing it in order to have a foreign government, announce an investigation into his political opponent, right? that seems pretty straightforwardly something for which you should remove someone from office. And I wonder what your take on that is, because I think like my perception, again, from your emphasis was if you're only emphasizing, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, whatever. What you're saying is this impeachment is silly, right? Like that's how a person reads that between the lines. If you only care about that, then the impeachment must be, super.
Yeah, I largely did think it was, let's say, supercilious, and maybe also a little silly, because I when the impeachment was ramping up, I was on the Hill show, The Rising, with Crystal and Sager, and one of the points that I made is, what does it say about our political system that everybody only gets it together to impeach for something that, in the grand scheme, even if you want to call it bribery, although, by the way, the House Democrats didn't even charge bribery. So, like, I don't know, like, why didn't they charge bribery if it was so straightforward?
Actually, Schiff answered that. I was wondering that the whole time. He said abuse of power includes bribery. If it had been bribery, we would have had to be more legalistic with our whatever.
No,
I mean, I thought he should have said
that's
bribery.
BS. I mean, I don't believe that. Abuse. I mean, the real reason why they did it, they put it under the rubric of abuse of power. And again, you can go read the piece that I did on this on January. So I read all the supporting material. Okay, so I sat through there. I sat with my eyes glazing over and read the House Judiciary Committee report, House Intelligence Committee report on impeachment. I watched a lot of the testimony, a lot of the congressional debate. Mm-hmm. And one thing that they did in these supplementary materials is that they made it clear that Trump, one thing that they folded under the rubric of this abuse of power charge. And by the way, even like relitigating this stuff seems ridiculous given that the situation we're in with coronavirus, but nonetheless, one reason that they folded everything into this abuse of power charge is because they were really implicitly alleging treason. And you can go and look at this House Judiciary Committee report. They were saying Trump betrayed the nation. That was the language they used in the text of the impeachment article. Mm-hmm. And then in the report, they defined abuse of power as they defined betraying the nation as functionally committing treason. Okay. And so they just sort of put everything together under that sort of relatively vague, non-legalistic rubric, because most of the charges, I mean, bribery wouldn't have held up to full scrutiny. Treason wouldn't have held up to full scrutiny. So they just said, okay, all this, kind of vaguely seems like abuse of power, so let's just go with that. And then they do also contempt of Congress, or I forget what the precise charge is, thwarting Congress in some way. It's just like, okay, so I mean, if you're so sure that this conduct requires only the third impeachment in U.S. history, I don't know, maybe you should be a little legalistic about it. Maybe you should go with bribery. And just like if they didn't, so doesn't that say something about the weakness of the case?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think we should evaluate the case on its own.
Well, I mean, then your objection was with Adam Schiff, not me.
Well, I got lots of objections, but so let's evaluate. Let's think about whether or not this is bribery, right? So Trump has a thing of value, right? It's actually what he has is something that legally, according to his office, he is bound to give to someone else, right? He has to give Ukraine this aid. And what he's saying is, I will do the duty of my office if you give me a thing of value, right? And the thing of value in that case was the announcement of an investigation into the person he thought was running against him for president. That is the textbook definition of bribery, right? That's if a police officer will give or not give a ticket based on whether someone gives him a thing of value, right? Let's say like a fire marshal will give you a license to operate if you give him a thing of value. Trump will give the thing that he is obligated to give. Trump will give this money, this aid. And I know it's military aid and you might be against it, but he was bound to do it. Trump will do his duty if you pay him. That's what happened. Where am I wrong?
Number one, the aid was never actually frozen. The aid was never actually withheld, because one thing that got lost is it was future dispersals of military aid. So one thing that the Democrats, in their hysteria,
but it didn't begin when it was supposed to begin, right?
No, it's not true, because Trump actually did disperse the aid by the statutory deadline, which means that there was no interruption in the dispersal of military aid. And one thing,
okay, but he asked for it to be withheld to the point where Ukraine noticed, right?
And you talk about why do I emphasize certain things? Well, I see Democrats sitting in the House of Representatives screaming that Donald Trump, by withholding military aid, caused the deaths of Ukrainian soldiers.
Agreed. That's wrong.
There was no withholding of the aid. It was a year, and there's a lag time of a year. The Democrats' own impeachment witnesses testified to this in open hearings. Okay, so when I see hysteria like that, and nobody's pushing back on it, because if you push back on it, it means you're pro-Trump, I say to myself, you know what? Screw it. This has to be pointed out, and it has to be pointed out by somebody who's not just a mindless pro-Trump partisan. Or else,
okay, but that wasn't my argument. So tell me what's wrong with my argument about bribery as I laid it out. What did I get wrong there? You say the aid hadn't been fully
But the thing
dispersed.
is, the House Democrats feel you're wrong because they didn't include it.
Okay, but what do you think? I now made the argument. Let's deal with just that.
I think, thing of value is such a. I mean, you talk about this stuff as if there's settled constitutional law about dispersals of military aid and whether it constitutes a thing of value.
Of course,
the Supreme Court threw out Bob McDonnell's conviction, the former governor of Virginia, on similar grounds, because they didn't feel that it was established that a thing of value was exchanged. Right, I'm missing the details, but it was like trips, shopping trips for his wife and
wife or something.
Golf memberships and stuff. But I read that decision at the time. I believe it was 2015, and so it's
do you think that decision was right?
On constitutional grounds, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I have a firm, constitutionally grounded opinion on whether it was the right decision. It seemed like it was not the right decision to me at the time, but
that's the great thing about impeachment. Is it's not beholden to that Supreme Court decision, right? Like the senators could say, like, this is wrong. It doesn't matter what happened with Bob McDonnell.
Rather, the House could. I mean, the House could impeach a ham sandwich. They can impeach for anything. They can impeach Trump for not eating a ham sandwich, or
not that he would ever do that.
Right. Just impeach for eating too many Big Macs. But bribery. It just seems like so the thing of value standard. I don't think it was sufficient. It was whether it was like. Because the presidents always do things, they always make actions contingent on receiving things that are potentially a thing of value, right? So one way to think of it, and I think this informed Tulsi's thinking in particular in terms of why she voted president, which was a principled and courageous decision, and I will defend that probably till I die, literally. But part of her thinking was, let's say a future president, right, makes a certain action, like a White House, a certain act, like the granting of a White House meeting, contingent on some behavior on the part of a foreign government, right? And part of the future president's motivation for establishing that conditionality is that he or she believes that they will gain a thing of value in that it will enhance their political prospects, because wow, we have a better relationship now with country X because they took actions, they satisfied my conditions, and now more Americans approve of me because of this successful foreign policy action. So they are receiving a thing of value in a sense from doing that. So what you're now doing is sort of hamstringing future presidents. And I believe that the standards entrenched, or the precedents entrenched by this impeachment, will actually be used and weaponized against future presidents, or even doing things that are benign. And
I really disagree with what you. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think so. So no, I mean, it didn't rise to the level of impeachability to me for reasons that have to do with the substance of the charges, but also, and this is what I brought up being on the Rising show with Crystal and Sagar. One thing I pointed out was that when Nancy Pelosi first got into the House after being elected in 2006. She sat for an interview with 60 Minutes, and they asked her about this small but vocal contingent of House Democrats who wanted to impeach George W. Bush and Dick Cheney over the Iraq War. And she said, "Of course we're not doing that. What are you, crazy? That makes no sense. That's ridiculous." So I'm thinking it from a more macroscopic standpoint in terms of what does our political system prioritize in terms of the egregiousness of actions that rise to the level of impeachability. And when you look at the Ukraine stuff, it all seems so trivial and inside baseball and ultimately pointless because, again, the aid was dispersed. So even if Trump did float this idea of, okay, maybe you should look into Biden's, okay, I mean, so reprimand him. If you really want to censor him, go ahead for that. But it just seemed like small, it seems so small in the scope of even actions that Trump has taken as president that are exponentially more egregious, in my view. Tulsa actually did mention this specifically in her by introducing a censure resolution simultaneous with her present vote, which of course was not taken up. But she talked about, seizing the oil of Syrian oil fields. Basically acting with this like neo-imperialistic mindset with regard to Syria, Iran, Venezuela, etc. And it's just like, yeah, I do question the basic priorities of the political and media system when everybody automatically wakes up one morning and says, oh my God, withholding military aid to Ukraine as a result of some unknown CIA whistleblower going to Adam Schiff, that's what we need to mobilize for and get Trump on. I think it wasn't about the Ukraine stuff as such. And in fact, Pelosi and Schiff and other Democrats confirmed this because they always said, look, there's the reason why this is now motivating us to move forward with impeachment is because it's part of the same narrative continuum as Russiagate. All roads lead to Putin. That's what Pelosi said. That's what she cited as her justification for going forward with this specific action as rising to the level of impeachability. It was because they couldn't get him on Russiagate. So they said, okay, what's something that has sort of like narrative continuity with Russiagate that we can like use to retroactively get him on all that stuff? And they actually did kind of surreptitiously insert some Russiagate stuff into the abuse of power article and then define it within the supplementary materials. And so that was sort of my, I don't know, maybe I'm rambling, but that's sort of how I thought about it.
Okay. There's a lot there. So you made the argument that now other presidents are hamstrung because they might make a deal with a foreign country, and if that deal helps them politically, then they won't be allowed to do it. I think that's really missing the point here. The point is that Trump did not do something that was in the country's interest and happened to also help his political fortunes because it was a good thing for the country, right? What Trump did was he asked for a favor, and the favor was just for him. No one else was being helped by that, right? So he used the country's power. He gave away something of the country's in order to get something for himself, right? That's why this bribery is so significant.
But I also think that in Trump's warped brain, he probably did think, and again, he's the elected president. I don't like the fact that he's the elected president. I want him out. However, he's the elected president, right? So he has a lot of unilateral discretion over foreign policy in particular. So in Trump's addled, eroding brain, he thinks that getting some kind of investigation into Biden is in the interest of the country because the country needs to know about Biden's malfeasance in Ukraine. So in a way, you have to be deferential. I don't like that you have to be deferential to the president. I think the executive has too much power, especially in the domain of foreign affairs. But we whip up this brand new standard because we need to have the emotional gratification of impeaching Trump, which obviously everybody knew wasn't going to remove Trump, but now he has this little notation on his Wikipedia page. Everybody can feel happy about that he was impeached. And it just seemed like an emotional outburst to me more than anything reasoned, because if they were reasoned, then they could have come up with actual impeachable charges, and they omitted all of those. And they just went with this thing that had this, again, narrative continuity with Russiagate, because that's what they poured all their energy into in the early portion of his presidency. It didn't come into fruition. Robert Mueller killed their dreams. It was a total joke. And they said, okay, the joke's on you because we have to keep this going in some mutated form. And that's what they did. And like, even so, I mean, we could debate the finer points of the bribery stuff till death do us part. But like, I mean, do you think, I mean, what, especially because we're in Corona now, And one thing that I've been reevaluating, because I accept blame for this as well. I was focused on impeachment in the Democratic primary race in late January, when instead of just being faintly aware of the lockdown in Wuhan, clearly I should have been paying more attention to that, but I was not. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not somebody who's, as a matter of course, pays a lot of attention to infectious disease outbreaks. But it turns out that was a big deal. And it's just like, does it, in hindsight, does it really seem sound? Does it really seem emblematic of a healthy political system? Everybody was focused on, oh my God, are we going to get the testimony from John Bolton? How is Mitt Romney going to vote on this pointless procedural maneuver? Susan Collins, all this stuff. At the exact same time when we're having a lockdown in Wuhan, and we probably could have taken preventative action that would have at least stemmed some of the harms of coronavirus right now that we're now going to probably be dealing with for months, if not years. I don't know. I think that my at least instinct to think of the exercise as futile seems in a way vindicated by this now hindsight look at how it warped our priorities at what is proving to be a critical juncture when not enough was done, not just by the pro-impeachment advocates, right, but definitely by Trump as well, by everybody, the media. Again, it just seems reflective of a diseased, pun intended, political system that everybody was so enveloped in that at the time.
Well, okay, so the impeachment began long before we knew coronavirus was coming, right? The impeachment was clearly legitimate in the sense that this person committed this obvious abuse of power. And also, I've seen people make this argument, the Trump defenders recently have been saying, well, if you weren't so distracted by Nancy Pelosi and this unnecessary impeachment, you could have done more on coronavirus. So, I mean, that's what a losing argument that is, right? Like, the president can't focus on two things at once. He was distracted, and especially because he didn't even do anything in the impeachment hearings, right? He didn't provide any documents. He didn't give any testimony. If he was distracted during impeachment, it was because he was watching TV during impeachment, right? There's actually no other reason why he should have been distracted by that. People sometimes make the argument that, Congress was focused on impeachment when they should have been focused on coronavirus. The thing is, Congress already does so little that saying that when they're impeaching they can't do something else, this makes no sense, right? It's Congress's lack of action is not because they have, they're following the media priorities. It's because they have structurally given away all their power, because the filibuster doesn't allow stuff to get passed, right? Because we have a split house. And the way we have evolved our system over the last 50 years basically says that if we have a Democratic House and we have a Republican president, we're going to get almost no bills passed, right?
Well, they got a big stimulus passed, so I mean,
yes, that's true.
But no, yeah, I grant the point about the structural evolutions of Congress. But I think there is an alternate universe, right, where there was no impeachment trial happening in late January and early February, right? And Donald Trump, as well as Democrats, are paying the requisite attention to the Wuhan situation and what it could portend for the United States. And they say, okay, we need a unified front, guys. We need Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, all standing together behind a lectern saying, look, forget your partisan interests right now. There is a mortal threat that we as a country need to all mobilize in preparation for. I think there's a scenario where that was feasible if they were getting the right information, and if they when you have Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer would have had to be there too. I forgot him. But when you had Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, as well as Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, everybody else sitting in the Senate chamber, falling asleep while the impeachment arguments are being made, struggling to stay awake, literally. It precluded that. Now, I'm not blaming that exclusively. There are other factors to blame. But, I think to say that it had no effect is ridiculous. And it's not exculpatory of Trump either. Obviously, he should have been able, And I've argued this in a piece that I wrote for a conservative-leaning publication. Okay, obviously Trump should have had the discernment to be able to distinguish between criticisms that are more on the side of hoaxes, like Russiagate, in my judgment. You disagree, fine. But he should have been able to distinguish between criticisms on that stuff and criticisms of coronavirus, which is simply a rational criticism of the lack of adequate preparations being taken. And he didn't do that because he was fixated on impeachment like everybody else. And so, yeah, I think you do have to. I mean, look, yeah, the third impeachment trial in American history is going to be a drain on attentional and political capital. I don't see how you can dispute that. And it's just a reality. It doesn't mean that that itself doesn't undermine the case for impeachment, which I think is undermined for other reasons. But it is sort of I think just a true statement about what the political system and the media system, because sort of one and the same, we're engrossed in what's now, in hindsight, but still looking like would have been a vital, critical time for us to be focused on a true threat. And so I don't understand why you or others refuse to acknowledge that. It just seems like a truism to me.
Well, it sounds implausible that if this impeachment had not happened, that in January we'd have Pelosi and McCarthy and everyone standing together hand in hand working on this coronavirus. Why would they be doing that in January if they're not doing that now when things are so much worse, right? And everyone agrees things are worse, and it's the only thing that anyone is paying any attention to. They're still not doing it.
Well, I mean, they are kind of. They got a giant stimulus pass, so they are kind of doing it.
Yes.
So whatever sentiment enabled them to rush through this enormous corporate bailout, in addition to some breadcrumbs where people get $1,200 in like 6 weeks. I don't even know when those checks are supposed to be arriving, but whatever. Whatever
sentiment is the world is falling apart right now. Right.
Yeah, so whatever sentiments enabled that now, a week and a half ago, with a leadership that had more foresight, wasn't bogged down in pointless partisan theatrics, which has been a feature of the Trump presidency since before he even entered the White House. Okay. With a more rational political climate where our collective psyche hadn't been crippled by a lot of this alarmist stuff that I talked about, by the Russia hysteria, by impeachment, by this idea that Trump is a fascist presiding over a network of concentration camps. I mean, he's like a literal Nazi conspiring with the Kremlin, by all that. And then also Trump's own histrionics. Okay. So it's like they feed off one another and they create this toxic brew that I think inhibited the ability of the political system to react rationally to what we now know is a true moral threat. And so that's my point. I'm not saying that the leadership and Trump would have all been like singing Kumbaya, but I think with different political conditions in the country that stem from some of the stuff that I've emphasized, to sort of circle back, what I've chosen to emphasize that maybe make people angry or that cause people to think I'm poking them in the eye. But I think a lot of that actually did have a real detrimental impact on the Democratic primary race, on the coronavirus response, because it damaged the political psyche overall, and that has a lot of second and third order effects.
Yeah, I just think, I mean, you remember what the Obama administration was like, right? Do you remember a lot of bipartisanship, a lot of people working together?
I'm not calling. I mean, bipartisanship is not even precisely what I'm calling for, because obviously that's like a pie in the sky thing that a lot of people claim that they want in theory, but usually.
Do you remember a functional Congress when Obama was around?
I mean, I don't think there was a crisis on this scale really under the Obama.
I remember multiple debt ceiling issues where our credit was eventually downgraded. I remember every budget coming in late. I remember fiscal cliffs and sequestration.
Okay, so yeah, the political system pre-Trump had a lot of problems, but I'm saying they got a lot worse given the Trump hysteria. That uniquely crippled. In terms of damage to the political psyche, which I know is a little bit vaguer of a concept, but the people who thought that Obama was a Islamist infiltrator who had a neo-colonial mindset, to quote Newt Gingrich. Yeah, those people promoting a false version of Obama did have a negative effect on the political approach of Republicans. I'm not, and of course, you have structural issues with Congress and the presidency and the media, and so on and so forth. But in terms of how the president was depicted, yeah, I think that did have an impact. But then now with Trump, the conspiratorial false vision of him was much more prevalent because it was coming from the centers of power in the cultural and media landscape, with New York Times, Washington Post, NBC News, mainstream Democratic Party. It wasn't just a handful of guys who were birthers in the Tea Party, right? It was people were pumping this stuff out non-stop. Russian asset, blah blah blah. So yeah, you're telling me that had no impact on anything? I disagree. I think it did have a very detrimental impact on things. And it partially explains why Joe Biden is laughing his way to the nomination right now. That's my thesis. You might
Can you explain what you mean by that part?
By the Biden thing?
Yeah.
My sort of working thesis, and I said this a year ago, when people were saying, "Oh my God, Joe Biden's going to implode. He has no chance. Doesn't matter that he was Obama's vice president. Forget it. Kamala Harris is going to be the nominee, or even Bernie." I always thought that Bernie was formidable. I thought there was a window of opportunity for Bernie. Maybe if there were some better strategic decisions, maybe a few things were done differently. But I thought, Joe Biden was a strong, if not the strongest candidate. Okay, notwithstanding the media trying to pump up Kamala Harris, which was ridiculous. And there was a reason in my mind why Joe Biden launched his campaign talking about Charlottesville, because he was saying the president was an enabler of Nazis. The president needs to be removed from office as soon as possible, because otherwise we will have a president who is enabling literal Nazis to march down the streets with tiki torches. Okay, so that's frightening. If you agree with that, if you agree that that's an accurate reflection of the American political landscape, then yeah, I could see why you would become a little more conservative with a lowercase c in terms of your voting preferences, right? I could see why you would be less willing to entertain the prospect of a Bernie who's obviously challenging to a greater extent the sort of established dynamics of American politics. Well, now it's just all about Trump hysteria all the time. Got to remove Trump. That's it. Because he's Russian-backed, he's Nazi-backed, he's running concentration camps, he's conspiring with Russia, blah, 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 blah. They try, and impeachment was an offshoot of that. So I think you sort of traumatized the electorate in a psychological sense, and you made it such that Joe Biden, for all his faults, was seen as the plausible nominee in these political conditions. And the people turning out, because we did have a high turnout in the Democratic primary race this year prior to Corona, almost to 2000, even surpassing 2008 levels. Mm-hmm. And those people turning out weren't like, "Oh my, yeah, we got to overturn the system. We got to, really, get on board with the Bernie agenda." Even though Bernie's agenda wasn't really overturning the system, that's a separate issue. They were normie Democrats of the type who caused 2018 to be the highest turnout midterm election since 1914. So the electorate's hyper politicized right now. Obviously, Corona's thrown a monkey wrench into that. But prior to Corona, that politicization was to what end? It wasn't for big structural reform, to quote Warren. It was, we got to get the Democrats back in power to get rid of this Nazi fascist menace. And I think that engendered a lowercase c conservative response, and therefore helped create the conditions where Biden could win. I mean, it was similar. It was similar in 2004. Obviously differences. But one thing I speculated like a year ago is like, Biden actually might have a better chance than people think, because in 2004, obviously it was all about beating Bush, and people's conceptions of what it takes to beat Bush were probably not right. That's sort of like their guiding impulse in terms of sorting their candidate preferences. And it led them to John Kerry. And, different situation now, but roughly analogous to the point that it didn't. I was screaming to people. I mean, the people I was accused of being a contrarian for saying Joe Biden was a strong Democratic primary candidate, and they were saying you are a contrarian for that. So,
yeah, I mean, I think like he was at like 30% from the start, but I guess among lefty Twitter people, you were contrarian. But I want to get to something here where basically you were describing the structural thing that has happened for the last 16 years, right? Where whoever, when the president is finishing his first term, the guy running against him from the other party is always about, this guy's terrible, we got to get rid of him, right? That's how it was with Bush. That's how it was with Obama. That's how it was with Trump. This is true. There's no way to really get around that, right? But I think a trap you're falling into here is saying that is always equally wrong. But in fact, if we look at Obama versus Trump,
no, I didn't say that, but go ahead.
Right, but I feel like that was implied, right? Do you think it's wrong to regard Trump that way? For the Democrats to think our priority should be beating this guy? Yeah. To have that be their motivating factor.
No, I mean, I actually think it's if you believe this histrionic depiction of Trump is accurate, then I think it's rational for you to behave in that way.
Do you think
I just don't think it's accurate.
Okay.
I mean, but that doesn't. But I still, my preference is still for Trump to be out of office. I just don't believe the most hysterical depiction of Trump.
Okay, sure. Maybe you don't believe the most hysterical, but do you believe, for example, that he is using the office to enrich himself in some way?
Yeah. I mean, it's just a statement of he is, right? So it's not a matter of belief. I mean, we can look at the hotel receipts and the golf course receipts, and we know that he is. Okay. But he was like elected with everybody knowing that he would do that. So I don't. People didn't know that he was a golf course and hotel and beauty pageant proprietor.
Yes, people did know that. But remember, there was a big show of him. I'm turning over all my properties to other people. I'm not going to profit from the presidency. We were all concerned about that. And then he held that big conference with his accountants and his lawyers, right? And all the manila envelopes. You remember that? And he said, I'm signing it all away. I'm not going to have anything to do with this. And yet we've seen that he has, right? Which is a pretty severe kind of corruption, isn't it?
So refresh my memory in terms of what exactly he's done that proves that he has a direct role in the business.
Sure. You remember when his resort was going to
host the G? Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean that was the red flag example, and I said that at the time, and then he canceled it. So it's just like, okay, yeah, there's some graft here. I accept that. But like again,
why do you accept some graft from the president? Some really tens of millions of dollars.
No, I accept the fact that constitutes graft. I don't accept it normatively.
Okay. Do you think it's a thing that we should be animated about, we as Democrats?
When you say we as Democrats, I mean, I don't have a firm attachment to the Democratic label. I've been a registered Democrat my entire life, but I am, so I guess I am a Democrat, but it's not like a big aspect of my persona. Animated by that? I don't know. It doesn't animate me for some reason.
Do you think we as citizens should be animated by the fact that our president is corrupt?
Corruption meaning he's getting graft by directing events to his hotels,
among other things. Yeah.
Again, it's notable, but it doesn't. Here's what I don't think it should animate this histrionic depiction of Trump as somebody who's collapsing the entire American constitutional order, which is pretty much how he's been depicted, right? I think that's a big stretch, and in fact, it's dangerous because it's warped. It's like it's undermined the critical faculties of so many people who are in the nominal anti-Trump opposition to the point that they created this fairy tale version of Trump. If the biggest abuse of power that Trump was committed was he had a G8 meeting that was scheduled to go to be held at Mar-a-Lago, or I think it was Doral, in Miami or whatever. Okay, yeah, that's something that I think is worthy of attention, but not this house is on fire, the constitutional order is crumbling, all our norms are being taken from us. Remember, the norms is something that people like to concern troll about, even though they violate norms themselves all the time. So they obviously assign no intrinsic value to norms per se. It's just about what they can use as a battering ram against Trump on any given day. Okay, so yeah, but am I animated by that in where I would, as a matter of emphasis, be giving you constant updates on Trump hotels all the time? No, I mean, I read about that stuff. I stay apprised of it, but does it animate me on a visceral level? No, it doesn't. Maybe that's a fault of mine, but that's just my reaction.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, so there are two different questions, right? There's a question of, is it politically wise for the Democrats to make a big deal of this stuff? And then there's a question of, should we as citizens be concerned and exercised about the fact that the president has done whatever things he's done, right? They're different questions. I think it's a mistake to say that the worst thing he's done is, the G8 thing. Although, by the way, this is a bad enough thing that he should be impeached for it.
Yeah, I didn't say that was the worst thing he's done.
Okay, what would you say is the worst?
That was the example of graph that you cited.
Yes. What would you say is the worst thing he's done in terms of what citizens should be upset about when our president does this thing?
I thought the Soleimani assassination was really bad. I thought that it initiated a state of war between the United States and Iran, direct state-to-state conflict for the first time since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And then we've seen subsequent, attacks since then. So yeah, it didn't launch into World War III. I know, I've pro-Trump trolls who constantly say, "Oh, where's the World War III you were promising?" I was like, you dolt. I didn't say that we were immediately heading into World War III. I'm saying this was a dangerous and needless escalation between the U.S. and Iran. So I have a little bit more of a foreign policy emphasis. So that's probably the stuff that I would cite to you, rather than Trump hotels, which I find, not that interesting, frankly, even though I do keep myself informed about it. I think trying to launch a regime change op with Elliot Abrams in Venezuela was pretty bad. Although, of course, the Democrats, by and large, all supported that. So you can't do your knee-jerk anti-Trump hysteria on that, because it also implicates the Democrats. That's a big problem with a lot of the anti-Trump opposition, is that a lot of Trump's actual most severe harms, in my view, tend to also inculpate Democrats.
So you're really describing foreign policy positions, right?
I think allowing his legislative priorities to be dictated by the Republican donor class was bad. Even if you're just a pro-Trump strategist, you're saying, okay, Donald, once you're in office, make sure you stay true to the MAGA agenda, America first, nationalism, something. Deferring to Paul Ryan and allowing him to dictate the first 2 years of your legislative strategy, and basically blowing all your political capital on a failed Obamacare repeal and corporate tax cuts, seems like not the right approach. And I was against the corporate tax cuts for other reasons, not because I'm hugely into economic policy, but because it seemed like it just entrenched oligarchic interests, and also, put a stranglehold on areas of New Jersey, the area of New Jersey where I happen to be from, because of the elimination of the SALT deduction. Anyway, yeah. So there's plenty of that kind of stuff. I think I don't know. Is the point of the question to sort of isolate what I am most animated by in terms of Trump's misdeeds?
Sort of. So one thing that I got from the answer is that you disagree with a lot of his foreign policy stuff. But I would tend to say that there are plenty of legitimate but bad policies that any president could endorse that do not rise to the level of misconduct in the office, right? And you can't impeach a person for having a bad policy position. But in Trump's case, we've seen many times when he has, in fact, committed some kind of misconduct in his office. And I was wondering, and I think we as citizens should be upset about this, right? Now, we as Democrats, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe Democrats should just ignore these things and talk about how his healthcare policy is bad and his tax policy is bad. And I find this really troubling, right? That we're left in this position where we all feel totally powerless to do anything about his corruption, where we just think, well, impeachment's not going to work. It's just going to improve his approval ratings. We sound hysterical when we talk about this, and his approval ticks all the way up to 48. So we just have to accept that he's a little bit corrupt, and so be it. And that, I don't know, I feel like that's a problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, what's the question to me? I mean, I'm trying to think of what even to add.
Do you think that's a real issue we're having? Like, are you okay? Just, yeah, he's corrupt. I don't care. But
I'm asking you to, like, name what you mean by corruption. And you said the Doral G8 meeting. So, like, what else do you mean?
Okay, well, there are a lot of other economic examples, right, where he's benefiting himself financially. We know from the hotels, the resorts, where he's gouging people, where he makes Air Force One or he makes Air Force planes stop near his hotel and then gouges them there. I mean, all these things. This is graphed in the tens of millions of dollars, right? So that's one thing, and that's, in my mind, way more than enough to get rid of the guy. There's also.
I mean, can I just stop you?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that Trump is motivated by personal enrichment? Do you think that Trump, once he gets out of the presidency, is going to lack for opportunities to personally enrich himself? It's like, I mean, I think a lot of it is just sort of self-aggrandizing. Oh, we're going to use my properties because they're the best, and I want people to know that they're the best, right?
Yeah, it could be.
I don't think it's enrichment. I mean, I think it'd be a little weird. It was like, oh my God, I got to get extra $3 million this year from my.
I know it does feel weird to us, but that's also what people who have hundreds of millions of dollars do, right? When they see an opportunity to get another $3 million, they're going to do it. That's how they got there in the first place. That's why people donate tens of millions of dollars to Republican candidates.
But Trump could get that in a night for one speaking engagement once he leaves the presidency.
Yeah, I think you might be neglecting how dumb Trump is. The fact that he doesn't.
I don't like that flippant attribution of dumbness for some reason. I just don't. I don't think he's dumb. I think he's got a certain style of intelligence which allowed him to win one of the most incredible upsets, if not the most, in U.S. political history. Okay, so you can't be a dumb person and accomplish that feat.
You're right. Dumb is not a good word to call anyone. And Trump.
Some people are dumb. I just don't think he's dumb.
Well, so
I think he's actually pretty smart.
People have different kinds of intelligences, right? Trump is clearly a very good con artist. That's what he's been his whole career.
How about a good political operator as somebody who dispatched, 17 relatively competent Republican candidates, and then toppled the Bush dynasty and then toppled the Clinton dynasty and won the presidency? I mean, does that make him a smart political operator?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go. That's why dumb seems like a little weird.
Yeah, but there's so much dumbness within it as well, right? Because he's got this very specific hyper targeted enrichment of his own brand, right? He's a great brander. We can't take that away from him, right? And all of his branding success comes from telling people how great he is and how easy everything is for him and how no one else can do it the way he can. But he also, so at times, yes, in one narrow, pointed fashion, he's the most brilliant political operator we've ever seen, right? He also is an idiot in some other ways, like what you mentioned. He used his political capital on trying to get Obamacare overturned. Like, that was so fucking dumb. What he could have done, and I mean, you tell me if you disagree on this, but because he was not beholden to the ideology of the Republican Party, because he was transforming it as he went and didn't know anything and didn't care, right? He had an opportunity.
Let me interrupt you. I was at a Trump rally in New Jersey. Actually, it was actually a fundraiser. Technically, he did a fundraiser for Chris Christie in New Jersey, but it was open to the public. And I got him through media access, right? And I remember I jotted down the quote, and he said, he was sort of like riffing. He was just going on as one of his long riffs, and he said, in describing himself, "I'm a conservative, but who cares?" Which sort of like it underscores the point that you're about to make.
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of his lack of attachment to a particular ideological agenda.
Right.
So, yeah, I think about what you're about to say is because he wasn't beholden to like movement conservatism or Republican free market ideology. Actually, I mean, one of the most amazing moments I think was after they were elected, and like somebody was interviewing Mike Pence, and they're like, he was like, "Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with now that free market stuff was sort of obsolete." It's just like, what? And it's like, okay, so obviously there was a big opportunity there to fundamentally uproot some of these assumptions embedded in how the Republican or coalition operates, and by extension the Democratic coalition, because they sort of work in tandem in ways or influence one another. And the idea is like he could have done something that was a break from Republican orthodoxy right away. He could have marshaled his political capital for that purpose, like the notorious infrastructure proposal, which never happened. If he went with that early on, yeah, I mean, I think he would have gained some Democratic cooperation. I think staffing the administration, using Reince Priebus, the chair of the Republican National Committee, to staff the administration, guaranteed he was going to have warmed over Republican operatives who obviously weren't even in line with the Trump agenda to the extent that that even exists. And a lot of Republican professionals just came to accept Trump because they said, okay, Trump is going to be a vehicle for us to get our judicial appointments through. So we're fine with having any Republican president, even if it's Donald Trump, if we can get those through. And, it's a little bit of a different story in terms of the national security Republican professionals, because they don't like some of the Russia stuff, some of the North Korea stuff, although it's a mixed bag. We like other stuff with Iran and everything and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I think if he did have, he obviously had enough intelligence to get himself elected under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, right? But he lacked the intelligence or the savvy or the know-how or the foresight or the discernment or some quality that's a little bit immutable, or some quality that's sort of a little bit amorphous, in order to like translate that into a governing agenda that was beneficial in a way to him and to the country, etc. Like I think the part of the reason why he won was like a legitimate yearning in the electorate for something different, and yet none of those the legitimate aspects of the things that fueled him to propelled him to victory were not actualized in a way that I find at all sufficient. So none of what made Trump interesting in 2016 is still in effect.
You mean two Republicans who voted for him?
To me. To me. I mean, I didn't vote for him. I encourage people not to vote for him. But I still, from an analytical standpoint, could recognize how he was sort of the tribune of an earnest and well-founded and justified desire on the part of aspects of the electorate, including like giving some crossover Bernie people who the Democrats tried to pretend didn't exist, but were factors in Trump's win in 2016. I thought that there was it was a legitimate Democratic expression in him winning in a way, and I don't think his lack of discernment, for lack of a better word, contributed to a situation in terms of a governing agenda where that wasn't actualized. Then again, you also have, and the Trump people will say this, and I think they're right to some extent, then you have to bear in mind that right away it was resistance on the part of Democrats. Resistance became a branding exercise. It was a way for them it was a way for the Democratic establishment and the sort of ancillary forces in the advocacy world and the media world to seem like they were edgy because they were kind of like stylizing themselves as if they were in occupied France when there actually was a resistance. It's like, no, I don't think there are brown shirts coming to your house and like rounding you up. I think you just want to have a branding opportunity here in the sort of the ashes of your failure. And so that
Sure,
kind of
there were some people for whom it was self-aggrandizing, for whom it was branding, but there's also a legitimate expression of this guy is completely unfit for this office in so many ways, and he's corrupt.
Okay, but how about this guy has a legitimate democratic mandate, and the fact that he was elected is a massive indictment of the political system. So therefore, instead of launching into this extremely overheated resistance posture, which didn't even accomplish anything, because you want to feel good about yourself, you want to have a pussy hat march, etc. I don't know. How about doing something good for the country, like working with them on infrastructure? I mean, is that too much to ask?
Yeah, I mean, is it too much to ask? The thing about the incentives,
or not conjuring up a fake Russia conspiracy narrative, that also would have been helpful. I think that also poisoned the well.
Well, okay, so the fakeness of the Russian narrative. I mean, I would imagine you read a decent amount of the Mueller report, probably.
Oh, I read the whole report. I read it right away.
Okay.
Not just a decent amount. I read every last word.
Yeah,
some sections multiple times.
I was
and I've read supplementary materials.
Okay, good. Yeah, when it came out, it was like, I don't know, it was like late Somaliland time, and I was just refreshing it. My internet was slow. It took hours, and I was just up until the middle of the night reading it. But so one thing, and we saw a lot of things in there that were legitimately troubling and not hoaxes, right? We saw that he tried to get Mueller fired. Let's start with what Mueller was doing, right? There was reason to suspect that the Trump campaign had coordinated with Russia. There were many reasons. One reason was Trump's campaign manager.
I don't even agree with that premise. I don't think there was reason to suspect. I think that was part of the fakeness. There was no reason to suspect that. I followed this unbelievably closely from the very outset, and I'm telling you that my reasoned, rational, reasonably well-informed opinion is that there was no legitimate basis for that suspicion.
Okay, well, let's probe it. So did Paul Manafort work for people associated with Russian oligarchs?
They were Ukrainian oligarchs, right?
Yeah,
it's associate. I mean,
okay.
But like,
all right. So let's
that's your grounds for suspicion that they conspired with the Kremlin.
Okay.
And look, I mean, we should wrap up. We're going an hour and a half. I mean, we could get in a little bit on this, but like, I mean, do you have like a foundational point that you can make on this subject, and then we'll wrap up?
I mean, I think the ultimate point here is that you have to do some real backflips to tell yourself that there was no reason to investigate this Russian connection and that the investigation revealed nothing. So for starters, right, the way Russia works is that Putin has connections with a bunch of oligarchs.
I've heard so many people start long spiels on Russia with the way Russia works. It's just like, okay, I mean, have you lived in Russia? I mean, have you studied Russia?
I've never lived in Russia.
Okay, no. So like but you know, I mean, I'm not even trying to denigrate you, but like, the way Russia works. But you know the way Russia works, how? Like, because you've read an Atlantic article. I mean, how do you know?
Yeah, there are ways actually to know things without going to the country where they happen.
That is true. That is true.
So anyway, so the oligarchs are an extension of Putin's power, right? This is something we agree on. Putin empowers these people. He allows them to own, let's say, the mining monopoly on some mineral. They get very rich, but that money is shared back and forth with Putin. These people are his operatives, right? This is pretty widely agreed upon about Russia. And that this extends to parts of Ukraine, right? The parts that have been invaded in particular. We know Manafort acted as a political operative on behalf of some of these people, and that he owed money to the guy whose name I don't remember right now. Maybe you remember. We both would have known this right at the top of our head.
Is it
with a D, maybe?
Derispava, something like that.
Yeah,
I could look it up.
Oleg Deripaska. There it is.
Yeah, that's right.
So
ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
if it was that big of a deal, right? If it was reflective of a Trump-Russia conspiracy, wouldn't we know that guy's name immediately?
We forget about it. Okay. So anyway, so we saw an email in which Manafort said, "Hey, I got this job. I'm going to use it to become whole." Right? He said, "I will brief you," and he did. He briefed this oligarch on what was happening within the Trump campaign. We know this to be true, right?
Yeah. It's not surprising to me that he used his position within a presidential campaign to try to impress his previous clients to whom he owed money. I mean, that's exactly what I would have expected Paul Manafort to do.
Yeah.
And
now the problem is that Trump has chosen as his campaign manager a man who does this, right? A man who owes tens of millions of dollars or millions of dollars to an oligarch, and who is using his position.
We could litigate all these relatively arcane details, right? That were like at everybody's top of mind 2 years ago.
Right.
But now we know what the Mueller report proffered. So does that cause you to reconsider whether the suspicion of a Trump-Russia conspiracy was warranted now that we know that there was none?
No. So there are two things here. One is the question of whether it was right to begin an investigation in the first place, right? When you begin an investigation, you don't know how it's going to end. With everything that we saw in early 2017, there was plenty of reason to start the investigation. Now, what we did find from this investigation was that a person, Roger Stone, who was in frequent contact with Trump, was also in contact with WikiLeaks, right? WikiLeaks operating as a Russian agent during this process. And Trump was informed of what was happening. Do you agree
WikiLeaks
that
operating as a Russian agent?
Okay. Yeah, you don't think so?
To me.
Oh, is it?
Well, I mean, that wasn't even established by Mueller.
Okay, so I think that was established in the post-Mueller testimony Roger Stone case. But
well, that would have been a handy thing for Mueller to establish in his report, right? And he specifically used Weasley language to say that he couldn't even conclude that the DNC emails were couriered specifically from any Russian state actor to WikiLeaks. So that wasn't even. I mean, Robert Mueller and his team of high-flying prosecutors had all the resources in the world. Had 2 years, had the full U.S. Treasury behind them, had all kinds of intensive investigatory resources available, and they couldn't establish that. And everybody agreed that Robert Mueller was going to be the final word on all aspects of the Trump-Russia conspiracy, and they didn't establish that, or a variety of other key tenets of the conspiracy. So it's just like, okay, now what? I mean, it's like, I'm not even sure what you're referring to by the post-Mueller report, Stone trial. I don't think that was established either. I mean, that he was communications. Sure, communications. What does that mean? I've messaged WikiLeaks in the past. I mean, I'm in communications with the Russian state. Yeah, because it's like that's what journalists did as a matter of course over the course of years.
What was the nature of your conversations? What did you guys talk about?
Just the weather.
Okay. So what's relevant is not just like, oh yeah, I sent them a message and they responded. What's relevant is the content of the messages, right? Which we know from circumstantial evidence was about the release of stolen Clinton documents, right?
Well, we also know that really the only meaningful exchange that they had was whoever was operating the WikiLeaks Twitter account telling Roger Stone to stop running around BSing and insinuating that he had direct knowledge of any forthcoming WikiLeaks releases. So it was a scold on the part of WikiLeaks to Stone for him to stop puffing himself up and making himself out to be somebody who had special insight into the operations of WikiLeaks.
Okay. So let's see.
Are you denying that?
I mean, neither one of us has the testimony here, right? I think it is not the case that was the only conversation he had with WikiLeaks. We don't have the direct communications. But like you said before about Mueller couldn't find the evidence of this thing being couriered from Russia to WikiLeaks. just because you don't see every link in the chain doesn't mean you're not able to figure out what happened, right? So, for example, you remember the Seth Rich story, right?
Yeah, all too well.
Yes. Okay. So, do you remember when Julian Assange went on TV and implied that Seth Rich was his source?
I remember when he didn't exactly imply that he was the source, but he brought attention to the Seth Rich
exactly.
matter.
It's the point. It's emphasis again, right? Isn't it? So Julian Assange didn't have to bring up Seth Rich, but he brought him up multiple times. And by doing that, he made people believe that Seth Rich was his source, right?
I would say that was one of the
his intention
of him. One of the consequences of him calling attention to the killing of Seth Rich. Yes,
right. But Seth Rich wasn't his source.
I would say, has that been conclusively disproven? Yeah. I'm not saying that he is or he isn't. I'm just saying, like,
I mean, you just said Fox News has retracted their stories now about Seth Rich.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not basing anything on. I'm not saying he is the source, people. Okay, so calm down. I'm saying I don't know that you can 100% conclusively say that he's not the source. Is there preponderance of the evidence that he was the source? No. But I mean, you're also
there's a preponderance of evidence.
You're also saying that WikiLeaks was a Russian agent, based on links in the causal chain that you grant that Mueller couldn't even establish. But you said that with conclusive certainty. So like, you're saying, asking me to offer conclusive certainty about something that I don't have the full chain of events for.
What do you think was Assange's motivation for trying to say?
And by the way, we should really wrap up. I'm sorry, as interesting this is, but let's wrap up shortly. What was his motivations?
Yeah, for saying Seth Rich was the source, for very heavily implying that.
To create. I mean, you're saying that you think his motivation was that he knew that Russia was the source, and he wanted to muddy the waters so people didn't.
And specifically
figure that out.
And specifically play into what politically would be best, right, for Russia or Trump, which in this case was make it look like it was a DNC guy who did it. Because Julian Assange has very clearly.
I don't know that Assange is like thinking in those terms of like what's best for Trump, what's best for Assange, or what's best for Russia. I think he's a provocateur. I think he knows how to generate a lot of excitement and energy around WikiLeaks publications, and so that was part of his tactic, and it worked. There was a lot of excitement and energy and attention paid to WikiLeaks publications for good reason. A lot of those publications were highly notable.
Yeah, I don't know. They weren't that interesting. I thought. Like,
I don't know. I mean, were you interested in Hillary Clinton's speech transcripts to Wall Street banks? I kind of was. She actually promised that she would look into releasing them in the primary in 2016 with Bernie Sanders, and then forgot about that and never released them. And we only got them because of the WikiLeaks publications.
Yeah, no, I didn't actually find that interesting. I did read them.
Okay. Journalistically, I thought they had value, and you read them, so they had enough value for you to read them.
Yeah. Well, I read some stuff that's maybe I shouldn't.
Okay, me too.
Okay.
All right, let's leave it there. Any final thoughts? Was this fruitful?
I mean, I was really starting to get into that Russia part there. I wanted to keep going.
Okay.
It's been so long since I thought about this.
Yeah.
I think there's some value to that. I still feel like you are sort of underplaying the. Okay, so there's this episode of The Simpsons. There's this line from The Simpsons that I think encapsulates Trump perfectly. Maybe you've heard this before. Have you watched The Simpsons?
I was a Simpsons obsessive for much of my adolescence.
So you've probably seen it. So Burns goes into the doctor's office, and the doctor says, like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. You have every single disease. And then he takes out he's got this door, and he's like, but what's happening here is they're all jammed into the door, and none of them can get through. So you're doing great. And Burns is like, oh, so you're saying I'm invincible? And he's like, no, actually, a slight breeze could knock me. And Burns like, invincible. Anyway, so I think that's like Trump, right? We're just, every single one of these things is all jammed in together and none of them break through. And we just become like, well, I guess none of them matter, right? And so we let our president be corrupt financially and morally.
Okay, let me interrupt you there, and then we really close this out. But when Trump, before Trump assumed office, I want to say this was in either December or of 2016 or January of 2017. I wrote a piece, you can go find it, where I said Trump needs a rational opposition, because if he has an opposition that is constantly mired in hysteria, in the creation of false impressions of what Trump actually is and the harms he poses or doesn't, then you're going to have a situation like that where all this stuff gets jammed into like the emblem of Trump and nothing actually sticks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I actually have a segment of my following where are conservatives, Trump supporters, libertarians, people on the right. And they say to me directly, I could show you the messages if you'd like, but if you want to take my word for it, one thing that they tell me, and because I go on conservative media, Tucker Carlson, conservative podcasts, write for conservative publications, as well as publications from the left, right? Well, one thing they say to me is, because when you do criticize Trump, meaning me, we take you seriously and we think about it. We think of it as at least legitimate, because you don't buy into every hysterical Trump criticism. You've been actually, you've stuck your neck out when it came to Russia, impeachment, some of the Nazi fascist hysteria, that sort of thing. So if you actually have a real criticism of Trump, you know what, we're going to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? I'm not tooting my own horn, but most of the people who scream constantly about Trump nonstop, they don't have that kind of cachet with conservatives, because they squandered it, because they bought into the false portrayals of Trump. They promoted them feverishly and made them a lot of money in some cases. It got them a lot of Twitter and Facebook engagement or whatever, and YouTube views, that kind of thing. And so that didn't lend itself to that didn't lend itself to a rational analysis of Trump, which could have made it such that stuff maybe did stick. Because now, like you say, it gets lost in the whirlwind, because a lot of that whirlwind is suffused with hysterical garbage. So that's why I thought it was prudent for me to point out when it was actually hysterical garbage. So when you have a Soleimani assassination, when you have a coronavirus inadequate preparation, when you have a fake withdrawal from Syria, which is actually just a reshuffling of troops in Syria so they could guard oil fields, when you had a regime change op in Venezuela, when you had a selling out to the Republican donor class, the list goes on, then that stuff can be taken a little more seriously than if you're just in this nonstop resistance with a capital R and a hashtag mode, where you're going to be tuned out, and you deserve to be tuned out.
Yeah, I mean, on some level, what we're talking about is being dishonest so people will take you seriously, right? Because they think you're a fair broker, rather than saying loudly what you believe to be true. And I agree, there is some value to that. I think when we look back,
I'm not being dishonest, though. I honestly regarded a lot of those criticisms as hysterical.
Yeah, but you're suggesting that I should be, right?
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm telling you what I do.
Yeah, but I think, and this is also about what is right for Democrats to do as a political strategy versus what should we as citizens be doing in this moment.
I'm not a Democratic strategist either, so I mean, they can do what they want.
Yes, but I think, like, at some point we're going to look back on the Trump presidency, right? And we are going to see the totality of his corruption and unfitness for office. And we're going to know that the resistance was right to be making these points, right? Now, maybe you don't like the style in which they did it, but
we're going to know that they were right to make the Russia conspiracy points. You think that's going to be vindicated?
So there were a lot of things about the Russia conspiracy that were not right. It was correct.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly, but yeah.
It was correct that Trump tried to obstruct the investigation, which was a legitimate investigation, right? That is true.
But he didn't obstruct it. I mean, like, it wasn't obstructed.
He sure did try, right?
embroiled his family and his business interests in a month-long legal ordeal that partially crippled his ability to govern. So he didn't obstruct anything. He screamed on the phone to Don McGahn once, and then nothing happened. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there were 10 instances of obstruction, right? Mueller thought that 3 of them there was no contrary evidence against, right? We could get into why Mueller didn't think he could bring charges, but it's obstruction, right? Just because the guy is bad at obstructing doesn't mean it's not obstruction. Look,
I suppose
if you try to destroy your evidence against you, but you fail, that's still obstruction.
That is true. So then why didn't the Democrats impeach him on that? I mean, it's so clear cut.
They should have. You're right. So we agree that was obstruction, and the Democrats should have impeached him for it.
I mean, right? I don't necessarily agree that it was obstruction, but I'm saying if it was so clear cut and so obvious, then why didn't they impeach on that basis? They waited until a Ukraine phone call.
Yeah,
and why didn't Robert Mueller bring and and Robert Mueller could have charged him, but he came up with this legal theory about how you can make allegations that are legally actionable and then just let them sit there and have your report be, in essence, a legal referral, an impeachment referral rather. And then the Democrats dithered. They gathered momentum for impeachment, but then the spark was the Ukraine phone call, which is okay.
Mm-hmm.
But
I agree. There were plenty of things they could have impeached for. They couldn't impeach until 2018, right? Until after the Democrats took the House. But yes, there are plenty of things they could have and should have impeached for, including obstruction, which was very clearly laid out.
Well, I don't think they should have impeached for anything related to Russia because I feel like the genesis of it was fake, and therefore anything stemming from it, even if it was technical obstruction, was therefore tainted and therefore not worthy of impeachment. That's my.
Did it bother you that Trump's first national security advisor was on Turkey's payroll when Trump was elected?
What's it got to do with Russia?
Nothing.
Oh, okay. So it has nothing to do with Russia. I remember the hysteria around Mike Flynn being that he was in hoc to Russia. So that was wrong.
Oh yeah, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something else. Remember how Mike Flynn wrote an op-ed trying to get the Turkish dissident whose name I don't remember?
I do remember that. Yeah.
Did that bother you?
What was the name of him now? See, I'm losing steam at an hour and 47 minutes. It was the
guy from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, which is weird. Who Erdogan accused of orchestrating the coup attempt in 2016. Yeah. Was that weird? I mean, yeah, but what do you see? We're talking about the Russia investigation. Then you ask me if I find it weird that Mike Flynn was on the payroll of Turkish lobbying.
Yeah, I know, because there's so many different elements. There are so many different elements of corruption and misconduct, right? And sometimes they're related, sometimes they're not.
Then, right? Gee whiz, if everybody should have been super concerned about Mike Flynn's ties to Turkish lobbying interests, then maybe painting a false picture of him as a Russian agent was the wrong way to go. Don't you think? Don't you? Yeah. Shouldn't you be really mad at Democrats then for taking that tack?
I am.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a revelation. I didn't realize that.
But what I'm discussing with you now is not the tactics of the Democrats, but rather, do you think there's an issue when the national security advisor to the president is on the payroll for a foreign country? Do you think that's a serious thing that we should care about as citizens? Forget about party.
Yeah, I thought that was legitimate. But I also know that Mike Flynn, a controversy was ginned up around Mike Flynn not having anything to do with Turkey. It was because he spoke to an ambassador. He spoke to the Russian ambassador on the phone, and that was called evil.
Right.
So we're talking about we're talking about the insanity of the American political psyche and how it's been crippled in its ability to rationally deal with true events like coronavirus has been undermined. I think the Mike Flynn thing was a perfect example of that. We had a months-long furor over him speaking on the phone in a fairly ordinary diplomatic capacity with the Russian ambassador. And that was part of the grand conspiracy that totally collapsed upon minimal investigation.
Well, you're describing.
But like, why aren't you? I mean, if you're so upset with Trump, then you should be in a way even more upset with the Democrats for obliterating any possibility to actually look rationally at what Trump is doing wrong, and instead erecting fake Trump harms.
Well, so I'm not happy with all the tactics Democrats have taken. I think the impeachment for Ukraine, for the Ukraine issue, was legitimate, was well argued for the most part, and was a very good reason to remove a president.
I agree, because if we can't fight Russia over, we got to fight Russia over there, so we don't have to fight them here. I agree.
No, see, again, that was irrelevant, right?
If it was irrelevant, why did Adam Schiff say it?
It was because he made a bad argument. He made an argument that was irrelevant, right?
Okay. Do you agree with Nancy Pelosi that all roads lead to Putin?
Yes, irrelevant argument.
Okay. If it was so, if there's such irrelevancies, then I don't know why they emphasize those things. We're talking about emphasis, right?
Yeah, because they thought it was politically wise. They thought it was the way to make the case, right? But you and I can clearly see that this was a cut and dry case of bribery, where the president withheld his official duty in order to get a thing of value, right? That's plain. Why the Democrats didn't do that is a question for them and their political strategists, right?
Okay, we've been down that road already before,
yes.
Earlier in the conversation. So do you have a final point?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay, my final question to you is: do you think this is a useful, productive conversation?
I think so. I think I learned a little bit about your worldview.
Okay. I think. Yeah, I do.
Okay. What do you get out of it?
We've been going for an hour and 52 minutes, so it better be. Just that when somebody feels like they have maybe grievances is too strong of a word, but like objections to your public presentation, that it's possible to hash those out in a reasonably rational and measured way over YouTube live stream. So we prove that is possible.
Okay. What about the politics of it? Is there anything that you thought I would believe that you were surprised to find that I didn't, or anything that I suggested to you that you think is worth further consideration?
I didn't spend a whole lot of time trying to anticipate what you may or may not believe. I had you mentioned in your initial comments to me, through text, your Russia stuff. That was part of, I think people were anticipating like a more like strident Bernie supporter style argument against me, which I'm actually going to have on tomorrow. So there's a cue. I guess maybe I should be a little more cognizant of matters of emphasis. I think that's fair. But again, it seems like I'm more inclined to debate stuff on the merits rather than tone or presentation or that kind of thing. But that said, I take the point that anybody with a platform of a moderate size probably does have a responsibility to at least be a little bit more mindful of matters of emphasis. So I accept that.
Okay. So I guess one final thing I'd want to leave you with is when you're considering matters of Trump's conduct, try to think about, like, when you see people reacting, think about, is this an overreaction or is this an underreaction? Because I think you always think it's an overreaction when someone lashes out at Trump. When sometimes I think we're
not the Soleimani. I mean, the Soleimani, and for the Soleimani assassination, I was accused of overreacting. I have trolls who are following me around even now, 3 months later, saying, "Oh, you were saying there was World War III." So no, I mean, it depends on the action we're talking about.
Okay, this is going to be the last thing, then we're going to go. Yeah. Do you think there are more shoes to drop in this Iran thing? Where do you think that's gone?
I don't know. I mean, I think Pompeo has signaled that he would have no qualms with using the coronavirus crisis as a pretext to overthrow the government. There was a leak to the New York Times a week or so ago about how they were claiming there was some kind of military operation possibly in progress to strike American forces in Iraq, emanating from Iran. Obviously, in the midst of a pandemic, would be the absolute worst time to have an escalation in military confrontation, because it would almost certainly exacerbate the pandemic. And so I don't put anything past the neocon adjacent types like Pompeo who are running things. So I don't know. I'm saying the Soleimani assassination set into motion a series of events where the U.S. and Iran now are in direct state-to-state warfare. So it's more dangerous than it was before January 2nd, whenever that was.
Were you happy about Obama's Iran policies when he was in office?
Happy is overstating it. I think it was better to have a deal than not have a deal. I don't know that it was with the approach that I would ideally recommend in terms of coming to some kind of accord with Iran. But prior to the deal being struck, I mean, Obama had bragged about how he had the most crippling sanctions in U.S. history against Iran, and I don't agree that crippling sanctions are good in any context.
You think we should lift the sanctions now, right?
Oh yeah, I think we should have lifted the sanctions regardless. I mean, maybe with the exception of extremely narrowly tailored sanctions around
nuclear.
Yeah, nuclear or like military provision, but the stuff like destroying their financial system obviously impedes them from now getting supplies and that sort of thing that they're needed to combat the pandemic.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, one thing it feels like people are missing in our foreign policy is like, we think we want our enemies to be economically weak, but really we want them to be economically strong so they can be stable and we can be trading partners with them. And yeah.
Well, I mean, because the goal of the crippling sanctions is just to ultimately overthrow the government. Because if you create enough misery, then the thinking is it's going to incentivize the population to rise up and overthrow the government. The Republicans were outraged when Obama didn't take enough aggressive action in their mind in 2009 for the Green Revolution to help assist the overthrowing the government then. But all evidence points to these sanctions actually not achieving the goal that is stated for them, which is to facilitate the overthrow of the government. In fact, they just often strengthen the government because the Iranian government, which has plenty of problems, can say, oh, look, it's the evil Americans who are now preventing you from getting the hygiene and medical supplies you need to combat the pandemic. So in a way, it entrenches the authority of the government.
Okay. All right. Well, it was good to talk to you. Try to sometimes make friends on Twitter instead of enemies.
You know what? I do. You might not believe this, but I actually have made a lot of genuine friends over the years from Twitter.
Okay, good.
Where like it transitions from feverishly combating one another over political issues to actually a genuine friendship, and also just lots of acquaintances, lots of just nice people that I've met over the years. So it's not, and that's why I don't hand ring over Twitter, right? Because I actually have used it for a lot of beneficial ends over the years that are different, that are distinct from just your kind of day-to-day political warfare.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. I hope.
Yep.
And maybe we'll do it again sometime. I'll tweet out this video so people can judge for themselves. And have a good day.
All right. You too.